Generally, there are three different ways to reference ideas from outside sources in your writing. You can do this through summary, through direct quotation, and through paraphrase. Summary evidence is where you condense an entire paragraph, multiple paragraphs, or even entire pages out of a text down into just one or two sentences. And summary is used to provide context to a more specific piece of text evidence, like a quotation or a paraphrase. And that's because summary by itself is pretty weak as evidence. Here's an example of summary evidence here. David Suzuki and Ian Hannington, bloggers for an environmental nonprofit organization, note that plastic bag waste is harmful to birds and marine life. And that's from source B of the essay we're writing now. This is an example of summary evidence because I've summarized their entire paragraph with all those statistics and details about how plastic bags are harming birds and other marine life as well. I've condensed it down into just one sentence, and it's very general. Since it doesn't offer any specific information, this sort of sentence would really only be good for providing context before I then offered more specific data from their text. Yeah, just using this by itself, this statement by itself, would not be very strong as evidence because it's just not lending anything specific to my essay. Direct quotation evidence is where you copy word for word what is stated in a text and surround that with quotation marks. Direct quotation evidence is used to provide specific evidence to back up your ideas or however else you're using it to further your argument. The example here, David Suzuki and Ian Hannington, bloggers for an environmental nonprofit organization, note that, according to the University of British Columbia, quote, 93% of beached northern fulmars, which are migratory seabirds related to the albatross, had bellies full of plastic, a substantial increase from the last time they were tested in 1980. And again, that's from source B. This is a direct quotation for obvious reasons. I've pulled the words and phrases directly out of the text, surrounded them with quotation marks, and this is a much more specific piece of evidence that I could use to actually further my argument. Lastly, we have paraphrased evidence. That's where you repeat what is stated in a text, but using different language. Paraphrase differs from summary in that it's not condensed at all. Whenever you do a paraphrase, it should be a phrase by phrase, sentence by sentence, rewording, rephrasing of what is stated, not condensed down from a much larger paragraph or whole page or something like that. Paraphrase is used for the same reasons that direct quotation is used, is that it can provide specific evidence for what you're talking about. And here's my example. David Suzuki and Ian Hannington, bloggers for an environmental nonprofit organization, note that, according to the University of British Columbia, 93% of northern fulmars, which are a species of bird related to the albatross, when found dead had ingested a greater amount of plastic than when last tested back in 1980. And that is from source B. Now, you may have noticed that in my paraphrase example, I still used some of the same words from the text. So here are some keys to paraphrasing on when you can and can't use direct wording and still call it a paraphrase. First of all, paraphrasing just in general is where you deliberately reword and rephrase what the authors originally say, maintaining keeping the same ideas, just using different words and phrasing. However, that doesn't really apply to ideas which are not unique intellectual property of the authors, like numbers and names of things. So when I cited the 93% statistic, I don't need to put 93% in quotation marks. That's not their intellectual property. It's not like their choice phrasing or anything like that. Same with the name of the bird. I don't need to quote the name of the bird. They didn't come up with the name of the bird. That's just common knowledge. So you only need to use, vary up the wording as much as possible, but don't go out of your way to reword something that is just kind of universally known, that's not unique intellectual property. Finally, the best specific evidence will use a blend of paraphrase and direct quotation. The rule of thumb here is you want to quote the words and phrases that are necessary to making your point and paraphrase the rest. You also want to avoid long strings of quotations in a short essay, like the ones that we're writing. Additionally, whenever you use ideas from a source as evidence in your writing, whether you are directly quoting it or paraphrasing it, your evidence must be framed, embedded, and cited. Framing the evidence means positioning the evidence like you would a picture within a picture frame. The frame in a picture frame surrounds the picture. And so when you frame text evidence, you're leading into the evidence by giving it context. That, by the way, is also a good place to use summary evidence in itself when you're giving context to the more specific evidence. And then always follow up the specific text evidence, again, whether quoted or paraphrased, by explaining what the writer is referring to if ambiguous, and by explaining how the evidence pertains to your argument. You never just want to let a source speak for you. Always follow up your specific text evidence with your own commentary. Embedding evidence only applies to direct quotations, and it's necessary because you should always use a blend of paraphrase and direct quotation, and embedding your evidence is often how this is achieved. Embedding evidence is all about embedding quotations into one of your complete sentences. This helps your evidence, your quoted evidence that is, flow along with the rest of your prose. Remember, sentences that contain direct quotation still must adhere to normal English grammar and syntax rules. Simply read the sentence without quotation marks, and if the sentence is still grammatically and syntactically correct, then you're good to go. You can just add the quotation marks back in. So that's a good trick to determining whether or not you have embedded quoted evidence properly. Lastly, citing evidence. This is a concept that is surely not new to you. You've been doing this for quite a while. But when you cite evidence, if it's a long text, you want to cite the page numbers. If it's a short text, cite the paragraph numbers. If it's a poem or if it's a text where you're given line numbers, always use line numbers. On the synthesis question in the AP Lang exam, you can just cite the source letter, A, B, C, D, and so on. And you can cite evidence one of two ways. You can either cite it within the sentence, or you can cite it parenthetically. And when you cite evidence parenthetically, you always cite it at the end of the syntactic unit that contains the evidence. I know some of you may have heard you always put it at the end of the sentence. That's not true. It has to go at the end of the syntactic unit that contains the evidence. The reason why you don't always put it at the end of a sentence is because sometimes a sentence can contain both synthesized evidence from a text and your own commentary on that text. We do this all the time with compound and complex sentence structures, right? And so if you save a citation for the end of the sentence, well, now it becomes confusing what actually the synthesized information is, especially if you've used only paraphrasing, right? If you put that citation at the end of the sentence, it makes it sound like all the ideas from that sentence are synthesized from a source, when if some of those ideas are your own commentary, you don't want that to be the case. So always put it at the end of the phrase or the clause that contains the actual synthesized evidence. Here's an example of putting all of those techniques to work here. In source B, David Suzuki and Ian Hannington, bloggers for an environmental nonprofit organization, note that plastic bag waste is harmful to birds and marine life. They cite a study done by the University of British Columbia which examined dead northern fulmars, a migratory seabird, and discovered that 93%, quote, had bellies full of plastic, which was a, quote, substantial increase from previous tests conducted in 1980. The increase in the number of birds that had ingested large quantities of plastic coincides with the increase in plastic bag use over the last 40 years. All right, so notice in my sourcing here that I've started off with my citation. That's perfectly fine. I could have done that, or Or I could do something like this, where I tuck the citation in after the the second sentence there. Okay, but either way, I've started off with some summary evidence that kind of acts as my initial framing that gives the context to the specific evidence that I'm going to give. And then I give some specific evidence about this particular study. I use a blend of paraphrasing, and I only directly quote the phrases that really have the most impact. That the fact that their bellies were full of plastic and the fact that this was a substantial increase. Those are the most important ideas to supporting my argument. So I'm going to quote that and paraphrase the rest. Then lastly, I make sure that the text evidence doesn't speak on my behalf, and I follow it up with some commentary, noting that this increase coincides with this other increase.